Great, very excited for this panel. Maybe just kick off, tell us a little bit about yourselves, and you got a great endorsement for ITN right off the top there.
Lovely introduction. For those of you who are not from the UK, you may know this, but we have 4 public service broadcasters, BBC, which I'm sure you know, but also ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, who are commercial broadcasters. And we at ITN make the news for those 3. And they, as public service broadcasters, have an obligation to provide a certain amount of content that's in the public interest, including impartial, well-funded, high-quality news, which is where we come in.
Great.
And I was editor-in-chief of The Guardian for 20 years, oversaw the move from being a medium-scale broadsheet paper in the UK to being a big global player in the digital space. And for the last 3 years, I've been part of the oversight board, which is looking at the content on Meta and the decisions about what should be allowed on social media platforms like Meta.
Great. Well, objectivity, for people who aren't journalists, I mean, I think objectivity is one of those things that if you go to journalism school, will fill hours of lectures and many books, and is a very serious thing that people think about. So we're going to boil that all down to a 20-minute panel, go through the whole thing. I just want to start off. Obviously, you're very both deeply experienced in journalism. How do you see objectivity? What does it mean for you and for the newsrooms that you've led?
I mean, for me, being objective is really approaching every story without any agenda or personal bias. It's making it fact-based and fact-checked and impartial. If there are different sides to a story, different opinions, it's giving them equal weight and treating them fairly and remaining neutral throughout. But that's my view. I think it can be quite subjective.
I don't like the word objectivity. I don't think it's a useful word. Because without swinging wholeheartedly to the subjectivity side of the argument, I think we have to concede that the moment you start writing a headline, the moment you choose what story you're going to do, are you going to do the Titanic or are you going to do the 500 people in the Mediterranean? That's a subjective choice. And the way that you frame those, the moment you write your first sentence in a piece, you're making a subjective choice. So I find objectivity not a very useful word. I think impartial is a good word, and as a print journalist working in a very subjective space in the UK, I think the importance of that being counterbalanced by what Rachel's talking about, the obligation to be impartial, is so important. And I think what Rachel said about being fact-based, there are millions of opinions in the world, and it's great to have that people have opinions, but opinions are pretty worthless unless they're based on facts, and facts are the things that are, I think, being threatened today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would absolutely defend opinion within objective reporting, and certainly we have a lot of very specialist correspondence editors who, based on what they're witnessing and based on their experience and years of being a journalist, can give an opinion on a story. They can call a story, but it needs to remain impartial, and it's holding on to that for me, because that's part of being a journalist. Otherwise, we could just hand over making news to robots, which is a different session, I'm sure. I think
that was the last one. So what about, it's hard to draw that line, though, I think sometimes, or at least that's a common criticism of that view. And, another term that's thrown around often is false balance. The idea that not every side should have two sides weighted equally. I think climate change is one issue where there's been a huge sea change, literally and figuratively, around about how that issue is covered, where maybe 20, 30 years ago, you'd have someone who believed that climate change existed and someone that didn't, and now I think there's more of a movement to that is an established fact. So how do you draw that line between impartial and what might be a false balance?
I mean, I think you're right, and climate change was a classic example of that. I think we've seen other big issues, Me Too, racism, where you're not digging out the one person who thinks it's okay. But I think there's a bit more nuance to it as well, because I think it's about not looking for extremes and going to extremes. And say you've got a story about a primary school teaching same-sex relationships. You don't find the one person who wants to firebomb the school and the one person who thinks that's the only thing that should happen. You find the people in the middle. You find the people at the heart of the story, the parents, the teachers. And I think sometimes there's been a tend to go to the extreme when you're looking at balance. And I'm not sure that delivers the right story for audiences.
Everything is context related. I mean, you sometimes hear journalists saying it's not our job to report on both sides of the weather. You know, it's either raining or it's not raining. You don't report on the person who says it's raining and then have the person who's saying it's not raining. You look outside in order to... that's great when you can, but in lots of stories you can't. They're not that simple. I mean, let's think of the difference between tobacco and vaping. On tobacco, I think the science is completely clear, and it would be crazy to challenge that science, and that would be a terrible side. That would be a terrible case of both sidesism if you had people in to state the anti-tobacco case. Vaping seems to me the jury is out to some extent, and so I think if I was running a newsroom today, I would want an open mind on vaping. I would want both sides of that story, but not on tobacco. Climate change is one where I think if we're looking at the causes of climate change, there should be no argument. If you're looking at the solutions of how you ameliorate or mitigate climate change, I think there's plenty of debate about that. So context is all, and that's really why we need journalists to make those kind of decisions.
Yeah, and I think I would add into that I think one of the most important things is protecting eyewitness journalism and the funding that goes with it. And I think if, as journalists, you're going out and observing and witnessing, that's far more important than necessarily just finding experts. I mean, for example, I'm sure you saw our footage of the storming of the Capitol. We were one of the few broadcast teams that got inside, and rather than sitting in studios thinking, oh, here's somebody who thinks this and here's somebody who thinks that, we just went in and said, why are you here? What are you doing? And it's very basic. That is journalism. But there's a lot of journalism that isn't doing that, and there's a lot of threat to the funding of that as well. So I think it's holding on to that as the starting point for journalism rather than looking for debates where it doesn't necessarily have to be.
I want to talk about reader trust here, because I think that's a huge issue, and particularly in social media, has become a dire existential issue for a lot of news organizations, is how to maintain that reader trust. How do you think this sort of debate about impartiality or objectivity might inform how journalists can win back some of that trust?
Well, first of all, I think most readers don't think about it in those terms. I mean, when you see surveys done, people hate what they think of as bias. They love what they think of as accuracy. So, you know, we might think of words like that that mean more to people. I'm quite interested in what I think of as 21st century techniques of trust. So if you're on Twitter and you're not a well-known journalist or work for a well-known journalist organization, you have to establish your own brand of trust. How do you do that? Well, generally, when I observe people on Twitter, rather than expecting, they don't go there and say, I work for the Daily X, therefore you trust me. They say, look, here's my evidence of what I'm saying. So people are much better than journalists are at putting links in, or they'll put screenshots in so that you can see how they've established what they're saying. They're very good at, they would expect response. If you didn't respond, if you didn't allow response on Twitter, that would be a very strange way of using social media. If you get something wrong on Twitter, you would expect to clarify or correct it immediately. Otherwise, people in real time can see that you're not a serious person. Look at the way that a lot of newspapers behave, and you see the exact opposite behavior. They don't put links in. They don't give you their sources. They expect you to trust that I've got this source that I'm not going to name. If they get something wrong, they're very reluctant to correct it. And they're very reluctant to enter into response. Journalists, by and large, in my experience, don't like talking to the readers. And they're quite fearful of social media. So you've got a sort of paradigm of what earning trust looks like in the open, very transparently, in the 21st century. And I think we've got too many journalists who are still stuck on a 20th century or even 19th century model of us on a platform above everyone else, and we don't really want to hear from you, and you should just take our word for it.
Oh, I think you're right. I think we shouldn't take it for granted at all in any way. But we are quite pleased in TV, in broadcast news, that we are regulated. It's not often journalists like being regulated, but we do have very strict regulation, and that means we can hold our content up as having these standards. And we're not regulated for digital, but we choose to do the same compliance with all our digital content so that people know what they're coming to has gone by those same standards. But I think it's something we have to all keep working on, as you say. And there's lots of scope for transparency. People are doing it in different ways. It's one of the things I like about being able to do so much more on a story through your digital platforms. You can do the podcast of what's behind the story. You can explain what's gone into it. And I think we have to keep that dialogue going. You can't do on every story all the time, otherwise you do one story a day, but I think there's scope for that, which is important.
I think as journalists, we sometimes imagine that what is obvious to us is obvious to readers or viewers. So if you take what we're talking about to the most basic thing, what is journalism? So journalism is Fox News. Journalism is ITV News. Two completely different ideas of what journalism. Journalism is the Daily Mail in Britain, but journalism is also the BBC. Journalism is the New York Times, and journalism is also the Sun. I mean, I've named 6 organizations, all of whom have completely different ideas of what journalism is, and yet we use that one word, journalism, to describe it all, as though the readers, you make your minds up. And I think we're going to have to be a bit more basic about how we label things and about how we describe the craft that we use, because the craft that you use is miles away from the craft that Fox TV uses. And we just had the veil peeled back a bit on the kind of internal discussions that go on there, which would be very different from the kind of organization that Rachel runs.
I think as well, for me, it's not just about us creating that style of journalism. It's making it easy for audiences or readers to find. And that's certainly something we're working on. There's a lot of legislation going through in the UK at the moment about the prominence of these public service broadcasters in a non-linear age. And for us, we're keen to make sure that news within that is also prominent. So at the moment, you can turn on the television at 10 o'clock and know that you've got this trusted impartial news. What does that look like when we're not linear? And it's allowing audiences that being able to access it quickly and easily. And it's not just me trying to preserve our business model. I think there is a very real duty on our behalf to make sure people can access that trusted information. Just look at COVID, for example, and people need to easily and quickly find that information to keep themselves and their families and their businesses safe. And so it's making sure in the sort of mass of noise added to it, mis and disinformation, that our style of journalism reaches people and rises to the top as well.
Mm-hmm. I'd actually be curious to learn a bit more about the standards you were talking about. I think in Canada, that's a debate we're starting to have with some of the legislation that's been going through, where because of the tax credits that have been created and this new bill about forcing social media companies and online giants to negotiate over ad revenue, that some of that has creeped into our journalism. And so I think there's sometimes a worry about, like, you don't want the government to say what is and what isn't journalist.
Yeah.
So how does that work in
Yeah, so we don't see it as the government. It's an independent body. It's government created, but it's independent, called Ofcom. And complaints go to them, and they assess them, and they will rule on those. So it's very. If at any point I thought the government was telling my news organisations what to do or what not to do, we'd be up in arms about it. But it just sets a standard, I suppose, of this impartial news, and therefore sits above what we do, which I think is useful for us.
Why I think this model of public service broadcasting is so essential is that a pattern is beginning to develop that we can now see that elites. I once had a conversation with Dean Baquet when he was executive editor of the New York Times, and the New York Times paywall has been highly successful. And Dean, who's African-American, said, I never forget where I came from, the kind of background that I came from, and I worry that although the New York Times is hugely successful, it's read by 3% of the American population. So I'm worried about the 97% of the population that is not reading the New York Times and is accessing Fox News and talk radio or the internet or wherever else they're getting. And this is a pattern that we're now seeing, that in societies, the 10% are highly informed, and then you've got 90% who aren't. And that seems to me why it's so important that we have organizations like CBC, the BBC, ITV, that are there for everybody, and where you can more or less take it on trust, and people do. So if you look at the levels of trust in the UK, ITV, BBC, right up the top, the nearest newspaper is about halfway, even the best newspaper is nowhere in touching distance. And I think this chasm between the informed and the uninformed, between the elites and the rest, leads in and creates a kind of populism which is really dangerous.
And I think as well, it's going back to what I was saying, we can't sit back and assume that audiences are going to come to linear television. That's why we've got to go onto the platforms and go to where people want to consume news. But that works at the moment because we're funded for television. So it's holding on to that funding so that you can still show what's going on in Ukraine, or you can do undercover investigations on social housing, or you can do Partygate, which some of you may know about. You know, and it's holding on to that funding to make sure that we can still get that out, whatever the platform.
And obviously the news industry, there's a lot of disruption going on right now in terms of the business models. And when we're looking at objectivity, some of the businesses that have been successful now seem to be ones that can get a certain niche, a certain audience around them, and monetize that. And but I wonder sometimes whether that helps push them more towards that sort of perspective of that audience. Do you think that objectivity will be, and this idea of impartiality will be kind of threatened by the changes to business models?
Well, there's no ideal form of ownership. So we can think of certain proprietors, not name any names, Rupert Murdoch, but which bring with it awful problems. And actually, a reader funder model is also problematic, unless you've got editors who disregard it. I mean, I remember Tina Brown using the phrase, "You have to bite the hand that reads you." So you have to be prepared to face down the prejudices of your audiences. It matters, I think, less to Rachel. I don't think you worry about the political inclinations of your audience.
No, not at the moment. That's not what part of impartial news is. And I think we have a duty to go out and tell the stories that we think that matter, and leave it to other people to make up their minds politically. I'm not feeling any pressure to go in a certain direction. We can't because of the way we're regulated. But no, it's not disrupting broadcast news, but that's not the same for all parts of the industry.
I think we know now, after 20 years of the kind of disruption that you're talking about, and maybe it's relevant to mention this today in Canada, that we know what doesn't work. If you have a lot of conglomeration of news titles, enormous cutting of newsrooms, journalism, the idea that press releases come in and 5 minutes later the story comes out, that the readers can smell that, and it doesn't work, and they think, why should I bother to switch onto that or buy it? If you do the opposite, and you invest very heavily in investigative journalism, which we did at The Guardian, we did phone hacking, we did torture rendition, we did tax avoidance, we did Edward Snowden, we did Julian Assange. When you go to the readers and say, will you support us? They say, well, if you do that kind of journalism, we will. So you've got two models. And that, to me, I think readers can sniff proper journalism that deserves to be trusted, and that deserves to succeed. And they can also see the opposite when managements are really just trying to milk the cow while it's still alive, knowing that it's going to die. So I think there's an awful lot of mist and chaos around the information environment at the moment. But I think the myths are beginning to clear.
All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.